The Matilda infantry tank weighed 26 tons and crawled across the Libyan plateau at 15 miles per hour, roughly the pace of a man jogging with full kit. And Corporal Jack Hennessy from Broken Hill had calculated that at maximum range, a German 50mm anti-tank gun could fire 3 rounds in the time it took his tank to close 100 yards. The first shot typically fell short, the second adjusted, and the third killed. If this topic resonates with you, subscribe and support the episode. Late November 1941, and the Australian 9th Division's tank crews had already lost 11 Matildas in the first week of Operation Crusader. Not to Tiger tanks, those wouldn't arrive in Africa for another year, but to the PaK-38 and its tungsten cord ammunition that punched through the Matilda's frontal armour like a nail through tin. The mathematics was simple and brutal. German rangefinders were precision instruments, stereoscopic devices that calculated distance through triangulation with disturbing accuracy. A trained crew could acquire a target, compute range, and fire with lethal precision in under 20 seconds. Lieutenant David Fraser stood in the commander's cupola of his tank, designated Bardia Bill, watching the morning light turn the escarpment near Sidi Rezeg from purple to rust orange. The desert had its own beauty, he supposed, though it was hard to appreciate aesthetics when you were essentially commanding a mobile coffin. His wireless operator, Private Tommy Chen from Darwin, was half Chinese and wholly Australian, a distinction that mattered less out here than whether you could strip a Browning machine gun blindfolded. Chen had been monitoring German radio chatter, fragmentary, technical, occasionally panicked, and Fraser had learned to read the quality of Chen's silence. Right now, it suggested the Germans were organising something unpleasant. Fraser noticed something odd during yesterday's engagement near the Tri-Capuzzo track. When Sergeant McKenzie's tank, quote, 1, had been hit and began belching thick black smoke from a damaged fuel line, 2 subsequent German shells had sailed wide. Very wide. Not the near misses you'd expect from competent gunners adjusting fire, but genuine misses that suggested the rangefinder crew had lost their target entirely. McKenzie had somehow nursed his wounded beast back to the rally point, trailing a smoke screen that looked like a burning oil well, and the Germans had wasted at least 6 rounds trying to finish him off. All misses. Fraser had mentioned this to Captain Morris at the evening briefing, but Morris had been more concerned with the fact that they'd lost 2 tanks that day and Mackenzie's Matilda needed major repairs. Fair enough. Morris was engineering officer and had to think about maintenance schedules and spare parts. But Fraser couldn't stop thinking about those misses. German gunners didn't miss that often, not with their optical rangefinders and their methodical training. Something about that smoke had disrupted their firing solution. The Australian tanks ran on diesel. This was a detail Fraser had never given much thought to until now. Most British tanks use petrol, volatile, efficient, and when penetrated by armor-piercing shot, prone to erupting into what tank crews called brewing up. The phrase was darkly ironic, suggesting tea kettles and cozy afternoons rather than men burning alive in steel boxes. The Matilda used twin AEC diesel engines, originally designed for London buses, which seemed almost comically mundane until you considered that those same engines were now hauling 26 tons of armor across North Africa. Diesel burned differently than petrol. Fraser had noticed this during training back in England. The exhaust was cleaner under normal operation, almost invisible compared to the thick fumes from petrol engines. But Mackenzie's damaged tank had been dumping raw diesel into the exhaust, creating that massive black cloud. What if that wasn't just a malfunction? What if it could be controlled, weaponized even? German rangefinders needed clear line of sight to function. Smoke would play havoc with their optics, turn their precision instruments into expensive paperweights. Fraser climbed down from Bardia Bill and walked toward the maintenance area, where Mackenzie was already underneath waltzing Matilda with a spanner, cursing in a steady stream that would have impressed a Glasgow dockworker. The sergeant had been a diesel mechanic in Brisbane before the war. Fishing trawlers, generators, the occasional truck. If anyone could tell Fraser whether his half-formed idea was genius or madness, it would be Mackenzie. Mackenzie slid out from under the Matilda, his face streaked with grease and diesel fuel, and looked at Fraser with the particular expression mechanics reserve for officers who've just proposed something technically questionable. Quote 5. He wiped his hands on a rag that was possibly dirtier than his hands. Quote 6. Fraser crouched down next to the damaged fuel line that had saved Mackenzie's life yesterday. The metal was scorched, twisted where the German round had grazed it without fully penetrating. Pure luck. A few millimeters difference and the shell would have gone straight through into the crew compartment. Can it be done? Deliberately, I mean. Creating smoke when we need it, stopping when we don't? McKenzie sat up, considering. His eyes had that distant look of someone running calculations in their head, mentally disassembling engines and reassembling them in new configurations. You'd need to overfuel the injectors, create an incomplete burn. Black smoke's just unburned carbon, diesel that doesn't ignite properly in the cylinder. Gets expelled as particulates instead of being converted to energy. He paused, pulled a cigarette from behind his ear, then remembered they were sitting next to a fuel leak and put it back. Wreck the engine eventually, though. Foul the injectors, clog everything up. Carbon deposits in the cylinders, damaged piston rings, the whole bloody mess. Fraser had expected this. You didn't get tactical advantages without costs, and engines were replaceable in ways that crews weren't. How long would the engine last? If we used the smoke generation deliberately, not continuously. McKenzie thought about it, his fingers unconsciously tracing patterns in the sand, sketching invisible diagrams of fuel systems and combustion chambers. Depends how often you do it and for how long. Few hours of heavy smoking spread over a week, maybe 2 weeks before she needs a full rebuild. Less if you push it hard. And you'd burn fuel like a bastard, maybe 30-40% more consumption when you're generating smoke. 2 weeks between rebuilds was actually better than Fraser had hoped. Tank crews rarely went more than 10 days without pulling back for maintenance anyway, especially out here where sand got into everything and mechanical failures were as common as enemy action. The fuel consumption was more problematic. Logistics were already stretched thin, and Captain Morris would have kittens when he saw the requisition forms. But that was a problem for later. Right now, Fraser needed to know if the concept was even feasible. Show me how it would work, theoretically. Fraser stood up, offering Mackenzie a hand. The sergeant accepted the pull-up and walked around to the engine deck of waltzing Matilda, pointing out components as he explained. You'd need a manual valve here, something the driver could operate from his position. Bypass the normal fuel regulation, inject extra diesel directly into the cylinders at the moment of exhaust. The timing's critical. Too early and you just waste fuel, too late and you get nothing. Has to hit the exhaust stroke when the cylinder's already hot, but the exhaust valve's opening. Private Chen appeared from somewhere, moving with that quiet efficiency he brought to everything. He'd been listening, Fraser realized. Chen was like that, always present when something interesting was happening, always absorbing information. Quote 15, Chen said. Quote 16, Fraser nodded. This was the key insight that had been gnawing at him since yesterday. German anti-tank doctrine relied on engaging at range, using their superior optics to pick off British armor before it could close to effective fighting distance. The Matilda's 2-pounder gun was adequate at close range, but outmatched by German 50mm guns at distance. If smoke could blind those rangefinders, even temporarily, it might allow the Matildas to close the gap without being systematically destroyed. Mackenzie was warming to the idea now, his mechanic's brain engaged by the technical challenge. Quote 17. He glanced at Fraser. Quote 18. Quote 19. Quote 20. Mackenzie looked at his damaged Matilda with something approaching affection. Quote 21. Fraser considered this. Morris was practical to a fault, a veteran of the last war who'd seen enough innovation born from desperation to know the difference between genius and stupidity was usually just timing. But he'd also want proof of concept before authorizing modifications to multiple tanks. Mackenzie grinned, an expression that suggested he'd already been planning to do exactly that, whether Fraser authorized it or not. Give me 2 days. Need to fabricate a valve assembly, run some controlled tests. But yeah, I can make this old girl smoke like a Portsmouth chimney when we need her to. The field workshop at Bir El Gubi was a collection of canvas tents and salvaged metal sheeting arranged around a cluster of disabled tanks in various states of disassembly. Captain Morris presided over this mechanical graveyard with the detached efficiency of a man who'd learned long ago that sentiment was a luxury the Army couldn't afford. He had a glass eye from the last war, Passchendaele, though he never spoke about it, and a disposition that suggested he wished he'd left the other eye in France, too. Fraser found him examining a damaged track link with the intense focus most men reserved for religious texts. Morris didn't look up when Fraser approached, just continued turning the twisted metal in his hands, reading the story of its failure in the bent pins and sheared welds. "Lieutenant, I assume you're here about something that will make my day more complicated." "Possibly, sir." Fraser explained the concept while Morris listened in silence, still examining the track link. When Fraser finished, Morris set down the metal carefully, as if it were valuable rather than scrap. "You want to modify the fuel systems to deliberately produce smoke." Morris didn't phrase it as a question, his good eye fixed on Fraser with the kind of attention that suggested he was calculating multiple variables simultaneously. Tactical value against mechanical cost, innovation against regulation, survival against procedure. Morris almost smiled. Almost. He walked over to a workbench covered in engine components, picked up an injector nozzle, studied it in the light. Fraser felt a flash of irritation that McKenzie had gone to Morris without telling him, followed immediately by recognition that this was exactly how smart sergeants operated, covering all angles, building support before the officer even made the formal request. Morris set down the injector. He paused. The workshop sounds filled the silence, the clang of metal on metal, the hiss of welding torches, the steady cursing of mechanics wrestling with machinery that had been designed in England and abused in Africa. Finally, Morris spoke again. "I'll authorize a test. 1 tank, limited modifications, controlled conditions. If McKenzie can demonstrate that this works without destroying the engine in the first hour, we'll consider broader implementation. But Lieutenant, understand something. If this goes wrong, if someone gets killed because an engine seizes at the wrong moment, that's on both of us." "Understood, sir." Morris picked up the damaged track link again, turned it over one more time. "There's another consideration you might not have thought about. The Germans aren't stupid. They'll adapt. Maybe not immediately, but they will. Every tactical advantage has a lifespan, usually measured in weeks before the enemy develops countermeasures. So even if this works brilliantly, you're buying temporary edge, not permanent solution." Fraser had considered this, actually. Chen had made the same point during their earlier discussion, approaching it from the perspective of signals intelligence. Every new technique created a signature, and signatures could be analyzed, predicted, countered. But temporary advantages were better than none, and in a war of attrition, anything that shifted the odds even slightly could mean the difference between a crew going home or going into the sand. They gathered 4 tank crews that afternoon under the pretext of a routine maintenance briefing. McKenzie had Waltzing Matilda positioned near the workshop, her engine deck open, components visible. Fraser explained the concept while McKenzie demonstrated the modifications: the manual valve, the bypass fuel line, the injection timing mechanism that looked like it had been fabricated from parts of 3 different engines and possibly a cooking pot. Trooper Bill Harrison from Perth, who'd been a sheep farmer and had strong opinions about everything from cricket to Churchill, raised his hand like they were in a classroom rather than a desert workshop. "Quote 39, quote 40, Fraser replied. Quote 41. Private Chen, who'd been making notes in his perpetual notebook, looked up. "There's another angle. The Germans have been in North Africa longer than us. They're used to certain patterns, how British tanks move, how they engage, what their exhaust looks like. We change that pattern suddenly, it creates confusion. Maybe only for a few seconds, but in combat, seconds matter." McKenzie finished his demonstration by starting the Matilda's engines. For 30 seconds they ran normally, the exhaust barely visible in the afternoon heat shimmer. Then McKenzie activated the valve. The change was dramatic. A roiling black cloud erupted from the engine deck, thick and oily, completely obscuring the tank within moments. It looked industrial, almost obscene in the desert landscape. McKenzie held it for 2 minutes before shutting down the smoke generation. Quote 43 emerged from her self-generated fog bank like a ship from morning mist, engines still running smoothly. Captain Morris watched in silence, his glass eye reflecting the sunlight while his real eye tracked every detail. Finally, he spoke, his voice carrying the weight of someone making a decision he knew he couldn't unmake. If this works, and you don't get court-martialed for destroying His Majesty's equipment, I'll recommend you for a medal. If it doesn't work and you do get court-martialed, I'll testify I never authorized this. He looked at Fraser directly. Fair enough, sir? Fair enough. But Morris wasn't finished. Quote 47, he glanced at the dissipating smoke. Quote 48. The test was scheduled for the following morning, and Fraser spent the evening unable to sleep, running scenarios in his head. What if the smoke wasn't thick enough? What if it was too thick and obscured their own vision completely? What if McKenzie's calculations were wrong and the engine seized mid-combat? War was full of brilliant ideas that killed the people who implemented them. December 3rd, 1941. The position was designated .175 on the maps, a low rise southeast of Tobruk that wasn't important enough for a proper name, but critical enough to die for. German intelligence had identified it as a likely staging area for British armor, and for once, German intelligence was correct. Fraser had 3 Matildas from his troop positioned hull down behind the ridge, their commanders scanning the desert to the north, where dust plumes suggested German movement. The morning was cold. People who'd never been to North Africa assumed it was always hot, but December mornings could drop below freezing, and the crews were shivering in their cramped positions, despite layers of wool uniforms designed for European winters, not desert extremes. Private Chen, crouched at his wireless set in _49_, was monitoring German radio traffic with the focused intensity he brought to everything. His Cantonese father had been a radio operator on merchant ships, and Chen had inherited both the skill and the patience required to extract meaning from static. Quote 50, he said quietly. Quote 51. Fraser raised his binoculars and scanned the terrain. There, about 1,200 yards distant, he caught the distinctive profile of a Pak-38 being manhandled into position by its crew. They were being methodical about it, professional. These weren't the half-trained conscripts that British propaganda liked to imagine. These were Afrika Korps veterans who'd been killing tanks since France, and they were very good at their job. A second gun appeared, positioned about 300 yards from the first. Overlapping fields of fire, mutual support, exactly what competent anti-tank doctrine recommended. Fraser felt his stomach tighten. This was it, the real test, not yesterday's controlled demonstration at the workshop, but actual combat, where mechanical failure meant death, and brilliant ideas could turn into catastrophic mistakes in the time it took a shell to cross half a mile. He clicked his wireless transmitter. All Badger units, this is Badger 1. Enemy anti-tank guns confirmed, bearing 020, range 1200. Will advance in line, standard spacing. Drivers, smoke on my mark. Continuous advance, no stopping for anything. His mouth was dry despite the morning chill. Acknowledge. Badger 2, acknowledged. That was Lieutenant Morrison in Bondi Beach, steady as always. Badger 3, roger. Sergeant McKenzie in Waltzing Matilda, and Fraser could hear the tension underneath the professional calm. This was McKenzie's modification they were betting their lives on. For 5 seconds after they crested the ridge, the Matildas rolled forward normally. 3 iron turtles advancing across open ground at their ponderous 15 miles per hour. Fraser counted in his head, 1001, 1002, giving the German rangefinder crews time to acquire targets, to begin their calculations. He needed them committed to their firing solution before he disrupted it. Quote 58. Black clouds erupted from all 3 tanks simultaneously. The effect was more dramatic than any of the test runs. The smoke merged into a shifting, opaque wall that advanced across the desert like something biblical, like the plagues Moses had called down on Egypt. Fraser couldn't see the German positions anymore. More concerning, he could barely see Morrison's tank 20 yards to his left, just a darker shadow in the roiling blackness. The first German shot cracked past somewhere to the right. Wide. Very wide. Fraser heard it impact the sand behind them with a flat thump. The second shot didn't come for nearly 10 seconds, an eternity in anti-tank gunnery. And when it did arrive, it sailed high over Bardia Bill with the distinctive shriek of a shell moving too fast to be a threat. Through his vision slit, Fraser could see almost nothing except smoke. This was the part he'd worried about during the sleepless night. They were advancing blind, navigating by compass bearing and faith. The Matilda had a compass mounted near the driver's position, and Trooper Davies was supposedly keeping them oriented on their original bearing, but supposedly, and actually, were different things when you were charging toward enemy guns you couldn't see. At 800 yards, he was guessing the distance now, couldn't verify it, another German round cracked through the smoke cloud. Closer this time, close enough that Fraser felt the pressure wave. The Germans were firing at the smoke itself, area bombardment instead of precision targeting. Smart adaptation, but area fire was inherently less accurate, and the Matilda's frontal armor could absorb near misses that would have been killing shots if properly aimed. 700 yards. 600. Fraser checked his watch, calculating their speed and distance traveled. The smoke was still pouring from the engine deck, and he could hear the engines laboring under the increased fuel load. McKenzie had warned him about this. The modification put additional strain on the engines, and they couldn't maintain smoke generation indefinitely without risking catastrophic failure. At 400 yards, Fraser gave the order. "All units, cease smoke. Cease smoke now." The black clouds began to dissipate, thinning as the Matilda's exhaust returned to normal. They emerged from their self-generated fog bank like predators materializing from mist, and Fraser had perhaps 2 seconds to appreciate the effect before training took over. The German gun positions were much closer than they'd been when he'd last seen them clearly, and the crews were frantically traversing their weapons to acquire targets that were suddenly, impossibly near. Quote_61_Fraser's gunner, Corporal Williams from Adelaide, was already moving, the turret grinding as it rotated. The 2-pounder might have been small compared to German guns, but at this range it was more than adequate. "Fire when ready." The Matilda's gun cracked, recoil rocking the tank. Williams's shot struck the ground just short of the Pak-38, throwing up a gout of sand and rock. "Reload, adjust up slightly." The loader, Private Murphy, was already slamming another round into the breech with practiced efficiency. "Fire!" This time Williams hit. The armor-piercing shot struck the pack gun's shield with a sound like a hammer on an anvil, and Fraser saw the gun crew scatter. One man didn't get up. The gun itself was canted at an odd angle, either damaged or simply abandoned. Morrison's voice came over the wireless, tense but controlled. Quote 65. Fraser traversed his cupola, trying to assess the situation through the chaos. Quote 66 was firing at something Fraser couldn't see from his angle. Smoke, regular smoke from burning equipment, not their diesel trick, was rising from multiple points across the battlefield. The entire engagement had lasted perhaps 90 seconds, and Fraser's hands were shaking with adrenaline. A fourth German shot, he'd lost count actually, slammed into the ground between Bardia Bill and Bondi Beach. Too close. The German gunners were recovering from their initial confusion, adapting to the new situation. This was the problem with tactical innovations. They worked brilliantly the first time, adequately the second time, and then the enemy adjusted and the advantage evaporated. "All units, advance to minimum range. We can't let them regroup." Fraser's voice sounded steadier than he felt. The Matildas pushed forward, and now it was close-range brawling, the kind of engagement where the 2-pounder's limitations mattered less, and the Matilda's heavy armor became an overwhelming advantage. German anti-tank crews were brave, professional, well-trained, but they were also very mortal, and at 200 yards, a 26-ton tank was a terrifying thing to face. The second Pak-38 fired once more, the round striking _quote_70_ somewhere on the front glacis, with a sound like a massive bell being struck. Then Morrison's tank put a round through the gun's shield, and the weapon went silent. Silence. Relative silence, anyway. Engines were still running, Fraser's ears were ringing from the gunfire, and someone was screaming somewhere in German, but the shooting had stopped. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. Badger units, status report. Fraser's voice cracked slightly. He cleared his throat. Quote 72. Quote 73. Quote 74. Quote 75. A pause. Quote 76. Fraser climbed out of his cupola, standing upright in the open air for the first time in what felt like hours. The battlefield stank of cordite and burning oil. Both German gun positions were knocked out, their crews either dead, wounded, or fled. 3 Matildas had advanced through 1,200 yards of open ground against prepared anti-tank positions, and survived with minor damage. But as Fraser surveyed the scene, Chen's earlier warning echoed in his mind. The Germans would report this engagement. They'd analyze what had happened, identify the smoke as a deliberate tactic rather than accidental damage, and then they'd develop countermeasures. The clock was already ticking on how long this advantage would last. By December 10th, the diesel smoke trick had spread through 3 regiments via the Army's most efficient communication network, soldiers talking to other soldiers over tea and cigarettes. Fraser had written a terse after-action report documenting the engagement at point 175, deliberately technical and understated. But the tank crews themselves had told more vivid versions in the mess tents and maintenance areas. Within a week, mechanics were being approached by crews wanting modifications, and Captain Morris was fielding requests he had no formal authority to approve or deny. The unofficial adoption created problems. A crew from the 7th Armored tried to replicate McKenzie's modification using parts scavenged from a damaged Crusader, and nearly asphyxiated themselves when smoke so thick it was almost liquid seeped back into the fighting compartment through poorly sealed hatches. They'd survived only because their driver had the presence of mind to shut down the smoke generation before anyone lost consciousness. The crew had been quietly hospitalized with carbon monoxide poisoning, and the incident had been officially recorded as, quote, 77, which was technically true if you ignored the part about deliberately generating those fumes. Morris, confronted with the reality that crews were going to attempt this modification whether he sanctioned it or not, did what practical officers had done since armies were invented. He tried to control the chaos. He pulled McKenzie off active duty for 3 days. McKenzie had protested vigorously, and had him draft a technical specification. Not quite a manual, nothing so official, but a document that outlined the proper procedure, the necessary safety precautions, and the multiple ways this could kill you if done incorrectly. The resulting paper was titled, quote, 78, and included diagrams that McKenzie had sketched with surprising artistic skill. Morris added a disclaimer at the bottom, quote, 79. He'd shown the disclaimer to Fraser with an expression that suggested he expected to be court-martialed any day now. The document circulated. Installation teams began working around the clock, and by mid-December, roughly 40% of diesel-powered British armour in the immediate theatre had some version of smoke generation capability. The modifications varied in quality. Some were Mackenzie's careful engineering. Others were improvised assemblies that made mechanics wince. But they worked, mostly. And that was what mattered when the alternative was being methodically destroyed by German anti-tank guns at ranges where you couldn't effectively shoot back. The German response evolved with disturbing speed. Fraser first noticed it during an engagement near Bir el Hariga on December 14th. His troop had advanced using smokescreens, expecting the confusion they'd experienced at point 175. Instead, they'd run into a carefully orchestrated ambush. The Germans had positioned their pack guns in a semicircle, overlapping fields of fire, and when the Matildas emerged from their smoke at close range, they found themselves being engaged from 3 different angles simultaneously. Bondi Beach took 2 hits in rapid succession. One penetrated the turret ring, killing the gunner instantly and wounding Morrison. The tank had to be abandoned, and it was only Morrison's quick thinking in ordering smoke generation, even as they evacuated, that prevented the Germans from finishing off the crew as they bailed out. The thick black cloud had covered their retreat, but Morrison was out of the war, medevaced back to Cairo with shrapnel in his chest and shoulder. Fraser visited him before the evacuation. Morrison was pale, his uniform soaked with blood that the medics had tried to clean up, but had mostly just smeared around. Quote 81, Morrison said, his voice tight with pain and morphine. Quote 82. The intelligence reports confirmed it. German radio intercepts mentioned, quote 83, smoke tanks, and included tactical recommendations for dealing with them. Position guns in depth, maintain overlapping fields of fire, use indirect fire methods when direct observation is compromised. The Africa Corps had always been quick to adapt. It was one of their most dangerous characteristics, and they'd analyzed the Australian smoke tactic with the same methodical efficiency they brought to everything else. Private Chen had been compiling data in his notebook, tracking every engagement where smoke generation had been used. He showed Fraser the numbers one evening, spreading the pages across a makeshift table constructed from ammunition crates. First week, we had maybe 70% reduction in accurate German fire when using smoke. Second week, down to 40%. This week, maybe 25%. They're learning to compensate. The statistics were grim, but not surprising. Every tactical innovation followed a similar curve. Maximum effectiveness at first use, declining returns as the enemy adapted, eventual obsolescence when countermeasures became standard. The question was whether the smoke trick would become obsolete before it had paid for itself in saved lives and preserved equipment. There were also the mechanical costs. McKenzie's prediction about engine wear had been optimistic. Tanks that used heavy smoke generation were developing fouled injectors within a week, not 2. Fuel consumption had increased by closer to 40% than the 30% he'd estimated, and Captain Morris was requisitioning diesel at rates that had supply officers sending increasingly pointed queries about wastage and unauthorized modifications. Morris handled these queries with bureaucratic jujitsu, responding with technical reports so dense and incomprehensible that the supply officers generally gave up rather than try to parse what was actually happening. But he'd pulled Fraser aside after one particularly aggressive query from a colonel in logistics and said quietly, quote, "The question of formalization was complicated by the fact that nobody wanted to take official responsibility. The modification worked, mostly, but it also destroyed engines, consumed fuel at unsustainable rates, and occasionally killed people through mechanical failure or tactical miscalculation. Any officer who officially sanctioned it would be vulnerable to charges of waste, incompetence, or worse if something went catastrophically wrong. So it remained unofficial, spread by word of mouth, and implemented by mechanics who were willing to bend regulations in service of keeping crews alive." Fraser found himself in the odd position of having invented something that was simultaneously too successful to stop and too problematic to acknowledge. On December 19th, a strong easterly wind demonstrated another limitation of the smoke trick. Fraser's troop had attempted to use smoke screens during an engagement near Sidi Omar, but the wind had scattered the smoke almost as fast as it formed. The Germans had waited patiently for gaps in the dissipating clouds, taking calculated shots when they had even momentary visibility. One of those shots had struck Bardia Bill on the turret traverse mechanism, jamming it in place. They'd survived only because Chen had grabbed the hull machine gun and returned fire while Fraser worked the manual traverse with a hand crank, slowly and painfully bringing the 2-pounder to bear. Afterwards, examining the damage, Fraser realised how close they'd come. If that shell had been 6 inches lower, it would have penetrated the turret and probably killed everyone inside. If the wind had been calmer, the smoke would have provided better concealment. If the Germans had been slightly more aggressive instead of waiting for clear shots. Too many ifs, too many variables, too much dependence on conditions they couldn't control. That evening, as mechanics worked to repair _quote_87_ traverse mechanism, Fraser sat with McKenzie and Chen, drinking tea that tasted like it had been brewed with sand. None of them spoke for a long time. Finally, McKenzie said what they were all thinking. Quote 88. But what else was there? They'd exploited a temporary advantage, bought themselves a few weeks of improved survival odds, and now the advantage was eroding. This was the nature of war. You adapted. The enemy adapted to your adaptation, and then you either found a new adaptation or you died. There was no standing still, no resting on innovations that had worked last month. The question wasn't whether the smoke trick was becoming obsolete. The question was what came next, and whether they'd figure it out before the mathematics of anti-tank gunnery caught up with them again. The engagement at Wadi El Faray on December 22nd demonstrated exactly how thoroughly the Germans had adapted. Fraser's troop, reinforced with 2 additional Matildas from another squadron, had been tasked with clearing a suspected German position blocking the coastal road. Intelligence, always optimistic, rarely accurate, had suggested light opposition, maybe a few anti-tank guns and infantry. Intelligence had been catastrophically wrong. They'd advanced using smoke screens, the black clouds rolling across the Wadi's floor in what had become standard procedure. For the first 90 seconds, everything proceeded as expected. Then the mortars opened up. Not random harassment fire, but precisely plotted concentrations that bracketed the Matilda's route of advance with uncanny accuracy. The Germans weren't shooting at what they could see. They were shooting at coordinates they'd pre-calculated, turning the Wadi into a killing zone regardless of visibility. Waltzing Matilda through a track when a mortar round detonated close enough to buckle the track guide. The tank slewed sideways, still mobile on one track but unable to steer properly. Mackenzie's voice over the wireless was professionally calm but edged with tension. Quote 90. Another tank, quote 91, commanded by a newly promoted lieutenant named Walsh, took a mortar round directly on the engine deck. The explosion didn't penetrate the armor, but it cracked cooling lines and damaged the exhaust manifold. Walsh reported flames in the engine compartment, and his crew bailed out into the smoke, emerging like ghosts from the black clouds as the tank burned behind them. Fraser ordered withdrawal, which was easier commanded than executed when you were under indirect fire and partially blind from your own smoke screens. They'd lost 2 tanks, hadn't engaged a single German gun, and accomplished nothing except demonstrating that the enemy had developed effective countermeasures. The after-action review that evening was tense, conducted in whispers because nobody wanted to say aloud what everyone was thinking. The smoke trick had stopped working. Captain Morris attended the review, his glass eye somehow more expressive than his real one. When Fraser finished his report, Morris sat silent for a long moment, then said, "The Germans have imported tactics from the Eastern Front. Mortars used in conjunction with anti-tank guns, pre-plotted fire missions, coordinated indirect fire. They're treating your smoke screens not as a problem to solve, but as a predictable enemy behavior to exploit." He paused. "You've made yourselves predictable, which in warfare is usually fatal." Private Chen, who'd been taking notes throughout the review, spoke up with the diffidence he always showed when contradicting officers. Morris replied. He gestured at the report. Fraser knew Morris was right, but accepting it meant accepting that crews would go back to advancing without smoke screens, taking fire from German rangefinders at ranges where the Matilda's 2-pounder was barely effective. The mathematics hadn't changed. 3 shots to kill, first shot short, second adjusting, third lethal. Smoke had disrupted that pattern, bought them time and distance. Without it, they were back to being targets in a shooting gallery. The discussion was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Major Henshaw from Division Intelligence arrived in a staff car that looked absurdly clean compared to the sand-scoured vehicles around it. Henshaw was regular Army, pre-war professional, the sort of officer who'd never quite approved of the colonial informality that characterized Australian units. He listened to Fraser's report with the expression of someone examining a mildly interesting insect. _quote_98_, Henshaw said when Fraser finished. Quote 99. He said this with the tone of someone conveying information rather than opinion, carefully neutral. Quote 100. Fraser waited. Henshaw hadn't driven out here to deliver mixed messages about policy. "We've been monitoring German tactical communications," Henshaw continued. "They're quite concerned about the smoke screens, actually. More concerned than the casualty figures would suggest. It's not just the reduced hit probability, it's the psychological effect. German anti-tank crews report feeling disoriented, uncertain, unable to maintain the methodical fire discipline they're trained for. Several intercepts mention crews requesting additional support or repositioning because they can't effectively engage smoke-generating tanks. Chen leaned forward slightly, his notebook forgotten. So, even though they've developed countermeasures, they're still psychologically affected? Apparently. The human brain doesn't like uncertainty. German rangefinder crews are trained to operate with precision, clear targets, calculated distances, methodical engagement. Smoke disrupts that precision, forces them to estimate, guess, waste ammunition. Even when they've adapted tactically, there's still a psychological cost. Henshaw pulled out a folder, extracted several pages of typed intercepts. This one's from a PAC 38 crew commander. Cannot maintain accurate fire against smoke-generating enemy tanks. Request permission to reposition to alternate firing position with better observation. They're being forced to move, to abandon prepared positions, which reduces their effectiveness even if they're technically still able to engage. Morris studied the intercepts with interest. So we're creating a dilemma for them. Stay in position and deal with degraded visibility, or abandon prepared positions to seek better observation angles, which exposes them to our fire. Precisely. And there's another factor. Henshaw produced another document, this one marked with security classifications that seemed excessive for a forward area. We've captured several German training bulletins. They're specifically instructing anti-tank crews on how to engage smoke-generating tanks, overlapping fields of fire, indirect fire support, pre-planned defensive positions. The fact that they're producing training materials means they consider this a significant threat worth systematic countermeasures. Fraser absorbed this. The smoke trick was becoming obsolete as a purely tactical measure. The Germans had adapted too quickly for it to remain effective indefinitely. But as a psychological weapon, as something that forced the enemy to expend resources and attention on countermeasures, it retained value. The question was whether that value justified the continuing costs in fuel, engine wear, and the occasional catastrophic failure. Henshaw wasn't finished. Quote 19. He said this without apparent irony. Quote 110. Fraser said. Quote 111. Quote 112. Morris interjected. Quote 113. The conversation continued into the evening, but Fraser's attention drifted. Through the tent opening, he could see mechanics working on Bardia Bill, repairing the damaged traverse mechanism by lamplight. The tank looked battered, scarred, maintained through sheer determination rather than proper logistics. That was the Australian experience in North Africa. Making do with what you had, improvising solutions to problems that official doctrine didn't acknowledge existed. The smoke trick had started that way, a battlefield improvisation born from desperation and McKenzie's understanding of diesel engines. Now it was becoming doctrine, being formalized and owned by people who'd never advanced through their own smokescreen toward German guns. Fraser wasn't sure whether that represented progress or the death of innovation through bureaucratization. What concerned him more was the steady erosion of effectiveness. 20% reduction in hit probability was better than nothing, but the trend was clear. Every week the advantage diminished as German countermeasures became more sophisticated. Eventually the curve would hit zero, and then what? Another innovation, another temporary advantage, another round of adaptation and counter-adaptation. War as an endless cycle of tactical evolution, with survival going to whoever adapted fastest. Henshaw left after extracting promises of formal reports and technical specifications. Morris departed shortly after, muttering about paperwork and supply requisitions. Fraser sat alone with Chen, listening to the night sounds of a forward area, distant artillery, the clank of tank tracks, someone singing badly in a maintenance tent. "We bought ourselves some time," Chen said finally. "Maybe that's all you can ever do in war. Buy time. Hope it's enough." Fraser didn't answer. He was thinking about Morrison, evacuated with shrapnel in his chest, about Walsh's crew, bailing out of their burning tank, about all the crews who hadn't made it, whose temporary advantages had run out before they could retreat to safety. Time was the only currency that mattered, and they were spending it faster than they could earn it back. By February 1942, the improvised diesel smoke trick had evolved into something approaching official doctrine, though the word, quote, 117 was doing considerable work in that sentence. The engineers at the main depot in Cairo, far from the fighting but not entirely ignorant of it, had developed a standardized modification kit based on Mackenzie's original design, refined through input from mechanics who'd been implementing battlefield versions for 3 months. The kit included a manually operated fuel injection valve, reinforced fuel lines rated for higher pressures than the original specifications, improved injector nozzles manufactured to tolerate the abuse of overfueling, and most importantly, a mechanical timer that prevented drivers from running smoke generation beyond recommended limits. The timer was crude, essentially a spring-loaded mechanism that had to be manually reset, but it worked, and it prevented the worst excesses of crews who thought more smoke was always better. Sergeant McKenzie had been pulled back to Cairo in late January to consult on the final design. He'd spent 2 weeks in workshops that had proper tools, electric lights, and engineers who used slide rules instead of intuition. The experience had been simultaneously gratifying and frustrating. Gratifying because his improvised modification was being treated as legitimate engineering. Frustrating because the Cairo engineers kept trying to improve things in ways that made them more complex, and therefore more likely to fail under field conditions. They wanted to add an automatic fuel mixture regulator, McKenzie told Fraser when he returned to the forward area. Electronic sensors, automatic adjustment based on engine temperature and load. I told them that was brilliant if you were operating a tank in Surrey, but out here, electronics fail when you look at them wrong. They need to keep it simple, mechanical systems, nothing that can't be fixed with a wrench and profanity. To the engineers' credit, they'd listened. The final kit was elegantly simple, something a reasonably competent mechanic could install in 4 hours with basic tools. Installation teams worked systematically through the armor units, and by early March, roughly 60% of diesel-powered British tanks in North Africa had smoke generation capability. The percentage would have been higher, but there were persistent supply issues. The kits had to be manufactured in England and shipped through U-boat-infested waters, and several shipments never arrived. The standardization brought improvements, but also complications. Now that smoke generation was semi-official, there were procedures, recommended usage protocols, maintenance schedules. Captain Morris received a 20-page technical manual that specified exactly how the modification should be employed, when smoke generation was appropriate, and what constituted excessive use. Morris had read the first 3 pages, then filed the manual in what he called his theoretical relevance drawer, which was where documents went when they were technically correct but practically useless. The German countermeasures continued to evolve. By March, Afrika Korps anti-tank doctrine included specific sections on engaging smoke-generating tanks. The recommendations were sophisticated. Position guns to create overlapping fields of fire from different angles. Use forward observers to track tank movement through smoke. Employ indirect fire to force tanks into predetermined killing zones and, most concerning, bring up 88mm anti-aircraft guns that could fire at sound or general location with enough power to penetrate a Matilda even through luck rather than precision. Fraser experienced this evolution firsthand during an engagement near Tamimi on March 7th. His troop, now including 2 replacement tanks to make up for losses, had advanced using smoke screens against what reconnaissance had identified as a company-strength German position. The initial phase went as expected. Smoke generation, reduced enemy fire accuracy, closing to effective range. Then the 88s opened up. The difference was immediate and catastrophic. Where Pack 38s fired flat trajectory shots that required visual acquisition, the 88s could fire on calculated bearings with such velocity that near misses were as dangerous as hits. Kalgoorlie, a replacement tank commanded by Lieutenant Barnes, was struck by an 88 round that nobody saw coming. The shell penetrated the sponson, continued through the fighting compartment, and exited through the opposite side. Barnes and his entire crew were killed instantly, so quickly they probably never knew what happened. Fraser ordered immediate withdrawal, and they'd retreated under smoke screens that felt less like tactical advantages and more like funeral shrouds. The after-action report had been brief and bitter. 1 tank destroyed, 5 men killed, no German casualties confirmed, objective not achieved. The mathematics were turning against them again. Private Chen's data collection had become almost obsessive. His notebook now contained engagement statistics from over 40 separate actions involving smoke generation, cross-referenced with German gun types, engagement ranges, terrain, weather conditions, and outcomes. He'd created what amounted to an empirical study of the tactic's effectiveness over time, and the trend line was unmistakable, declining returns accelerating as German countermeasures became standard rather than exceptional. We're down to maybe 15% reduction in hit probability at medium range, Chen reported during a quiet evening in early March. At close range, under 400 yards, there's almost no advantage anymore. The Germans have adapted their doctrine to assume we'll use smoke, and they've positioned accordingly. We're not surprising them anymore, we're just announcing our intentions. But there were anomalies in the data that Chen found intriguing. In several engagements, particularly those involving newer German units recently arrived from Europe, the smokescreens still produced significant confusion and reduced fire effectiveness. It's like the countermeasures haven't propagated uniformly, Chen explained. Veteran Afrika Korps units know how to deal with smoke. Fresh units from France or Germany haven't internalized the lessons yet. There's a knowledge gradient in the German forces, and we can exploit that if we can identify which units we're facing. This led to an innovation that Fraser hadn't anticipated, using intelligence about German unit composition to predict whether smoke generation would be effective. If they were facing veteran Afrika Korps anti-tank units, smoke might not be worth the fuel consumption and engine wear. If they were facing recently arrived units, smoke could still provide significant advantage. Warfare as information arbitrage, exploiting knowledge differentials rather than material advantages. The unofficial modifications continued despite standardization. One crew from the 4th Armoured had rigged a system that mixed diesel fuel with lubricating oil in a separate chamber before injection, creating smoke so thick and persistent it resembled a chemical fog. The mixture was spectacularly effective. German gunners reported complete loss of visibility. But it also fouled the engines so thoroughly that the tank required a complete engine rebuild after 3 uses. The crew was officially reprimanded for unauthorized modifications. Unofficially, the chemical composition of their smoke mixture was analyzed, documented, and filed away for potential future use. There were rumors, unverified and probably apocryphal, that Rommel himself had witnessed an engagement where Australian tanks advanced through their own smoke screens and emerged at close range before German anti-tank crews could respond effectively. According to the story, Rommel had initially assumed the smoke was from a new type of chemical weapon, before being informed it was just diesel exhaust deliberately generated. The rumour claimed he'd said something about Australian ingenuity being more dangerous than British firepower. But Fraser suspected this was the kind of story soldiers told themselves because it made the war feel personal rather than industrial. What wasn't rumour was the strain on logistics. Fuel consumption for units routinely using smoke generation had increased by 35 to 40%, and this was creating cascading problems through the supply chain. Diesel fuel had to be shipped from Egypt, transported across uncertain roads vulnerable to air attack, and distributed to forward units that were constantly moving. Every litre of fuel burned generating smoke was a litre not available for actual movement or combat operations. Captain Morris had been engaged in an increasingly bitter correspondence with supply officers who wanted to know why his units were consuming fuel at rates that exceeded official allocations. Morris's responses were masterpieces of bureaucratic obfuscation, technical explanations about increased operational tempo, higher than normal engine wear requiring more frequent maintenance cycles, difficult terrain requiring more power to traverse. All technically true, all carefully avoiding mention of deliberately burning fuel to create smokescreens. But the supply officers weren't stupid, and by late March they were asking pointed questions that Morris couldn't deflect indefinitely. The issue came to a head when a full colonel from logistics arrived unannounced at the forward maintenance area, demanded to inspect fuel consumption records, and spent 3 hours reviewing documentation that Morris had carefully prepared to be both accurate and misleading. The colonel, whose name was Patterson, and who had the exhausted demeanor of someone fighting administrative battles rather than military ones, finally set down the records and said, "Captain, I know what you're doing. Everyone knows what you're doing. The question is whether we officially acknowledge it or continue pretending it's not happening." Morris had looked at Patterson with his good eye and replied, "Sir, I'd prefer to continue pretending, if that's acceptable. Official acknowledgement leads to official oversight, and official oversight rarely improves battlefield effectiveness." Patterson had almost smiled. Unfortunately, pretending is no longer sustainable. Division wants formal accounting, which means either we stop the smoke generation entirely, or we legitimize it with proper supply allocations and oversight. He paused. "Given that stopping it would likely increase casualties, I'm authorized to offer the latter, with conditions." The conditions turned out to be extensive documentation, regular reports on fuel consumption and tactical effectiveness, and formal limits on when smoke generation was authorized. Fraser, listening to Morris explain this later, felt the familiar tension between military necessity and institutional procedure. They'd invented a tactic that worked, then watched it become progressively less effective as the enemy adapted, and now it was being formalized into doctrine, complete with regulations about when it could be employed. Chen observed. Fraser didn't answer. He was thinking about Kalgoorlie and Lieutenant Barnes, killed by an .88 round that had ignored their smokescreen entirely. The smoke trick had bought them time and saved lives, but time was running out, and the lives being saved were fewer with each engagement. Innovation wasn't enough. You needed continuous innovation, constant adaptation, and the Germans were proving just as capable of that as the Australians. The question wasn't whether smoke generation would eventually become obsolete. The question was what they'd do when it did, and whether they'd figure out the next innovation before the old one stopped working entirely. Lieutenant Fraser, promoted to captain in April 1942, found himself rotated back to Australia in a personnel shuffle that felt less like recognition and more like the Army's institutional need to distribute experienced officers across expanding units. He'd protested the transfer, argued that his knowledge of the smoke generation tactics was most valuable at the front, where those tactics were actually employed. But the decision had been made somewhere in the bureaucratic machinery that ground forward regardless of individual preferences. His last week in North Africa had been spent writing reports and briefing his replacement, a captain named Thornton who'd arrived from England with textbook knowledge of armored warfare and no practical experience of what it meant to advance toward German guns through smoke you'd generated from your own exhaust. Thornton had listened politely to Fraser's explanations, taken notes, and asked intelligent questions that somehow missed the essential reality of what combat actually felt like. Quote 133 remained in theater with a new crew. Fraser had said goodbye to the tank with an awkwardness that surprised him. It was steel and machinery, not a person, but it had kept him alive through engagements that should have killed him. The new commander, a lieutenant named Peters, seemed competent enough, though Fraser noticed he held the commander's position slightly differently, wasn't quite as comfortable with the visibility versus protection trade-off that every tank commander had to navigate. Private Chen had been transferred to signals intelligence 2 weeks earlier, his gift for pattern recognition and languages more valuable in monitoring enemy communications than in operating a wireless set in a tank. He'd given Fraser his notebook before departing, the battered collection of engagement statistics and tactical observations that represented 3 months of systematic data collection. "Someone should keep this," Chen had said. "Even if it's just historical record, it documents what we tried and what worked and what stopped working." Fraser had accepted the notebook, flipped through pages of Chen's meticulous handwriting and carefully drawn graphs showing the declining effectiveness of smoke generation over time. The trend line was unmistakable, from 70% reduction in enemy fire accuracy in early December to barely 15% by late March. The innovation's half-life had been approximately 6 weeks before German countermeasures reduced it to marginal utility. Sergeant McKenzie remained with Waltzing Matilda, now the senior tank commander in the squadron, after Fraser's departure. His tank had been knocked out and rebuilt twice since the original modification, and McKenzie had personally supervised both rebuilds, ensuring the smoke generation system was maintained to his specifications. He'd shaken Fraser's hand with the grip of someone who worked with tools for a living, and said simply, quote, 137. The journey back to Australia was long, uncomfortable, and gave Fraser too much time to think. The troopship stopped at Suez, Ceylon, and Fremantle, picking up wounded and transferring supplies in a logistical dance that seemed designed to maximize inefficiency. Fraser spent the voyage reading Chen's notebook, analyzing the data with the detachment of someone no longer personally invested in the outcomes. What emerged from the analysis was a pattern that Fraser suspected applied beyond just smoke generation tactics. Battlefield innovations followed a predictable life cycle: invention through desperation, initial effectiveness through surprise, declining returns as the enemy adapted, and eventual obsolescence as countermeasures became standard. The smoke trick had compressed this life cycle into roughly 4 months, from McKenzie's accidental discovery in late November to marginal effectiveness by March. But Chen's data also revealed something else. Even as overall effectiveness declined, there were persistent variations based on factors the Germans couldn't control. Weather conditions, wind speed and direction, humidity, temperature, significantly affected smoke density and persistence. Terrain provided another variable. Smoke behaved differently in wadis versus open desert, and German countermeasures designed for one environment didn't translate perfectly to others. Time of day mattered too. Morning inversions trapped smoke close to the ground, while afternoon thermals dispersed it rapidly. These weren't tactical advantages in the conventional sense. You couldn't control the weather or choose your terrain in most circumstances. But they represented zones of uncertainty where German countermeasures were less effective, temporary windows where the smoke trick retained some of its original value. Fraser wondered if anyone was systematically exploiting these variations, or if the knowledge would die with the handful of crews who'd learned it through experience. The ship reached Fremantle in early May, and Fraser spent 2 weeks in Perth before receiving orders to report to a training depot in New South Wales. The assignment was predictable. Take experienced officers, extract their knowledge, distribute it to new crews being prepared for deployment. Fraser understood the logic, but resented the assumption that knowledge could be effectively transferred through classroom instruction rather than lived experience. The training depot was populated by enthusiastic young men who'd volunteered for armored units and had romantic notions about tank warfare derived from newsreels and propaganda. Fraser's first lecture on tactical employment of smokescreens was met with attentive note-taking and questions that revealed fundamental misunderstandings about what combat actually involved. One trainee asked if smoke generation made tanks, quote, 138, quote, to the enemy. Fraser had paused, considered various ways to answer, and finally said, quote, 139, quote. He'd shown them Chen's data, the graphs tracking declining effectiveness over time, trying to convey that innovation wasn't a permanent solution, but a temporary advantage that required constant adaptation. The trainees had nodded, copied the graphs into their notebooks, and Fraser suspected most of them thought this was historical information about techniques that had already been perfected, rather than a cautionary tale about the limits of tactical innovation. There were bright spots. A few trainees grasped the essential insight, that warfare was an evolutionary process where both sides constantly adapted, and survival went to whoever learned faster. One private, whose name was Cooper and who'd been a physics student before enlisting, asked about the thermodynamics of diesel combustion and whether different fuel mixtures might produce more persistent smoke. Fraser had directed him to Mackenzie's technical specifications and suggested he might consider transferring to engineering after basic training. But mostly, training was frustrating in the way that all attempts to systematize experience were frustrating. You could teach procedures, explain principles, demonstrate techniques. You couldn't teach the moment of decision when German shells were bracketing your position and you had to choose between generating smoke that might save you or might just announce your location. You couldn't teach the feel of a Matilda's controls or the specific sound an engine made when it was about to fail, or the way smoke moved across different terrain. Fraser received letters from North Africa, sporadic and heavily censored, that provided fragmentary updates. McKenzie wrote that, quote, 140 was still operational, though barely, held together by improvisation and spare parts that technically didn't fit, but could be made to work with enough profanity. The smoke generation system had been rebuilt 3 times, each time with incremental improvements based on field experience. German countermeasures continued to evolve. There were reports of new anti-tank guns, better optics, modified tactical doctrine that assumed Allied tanks would employ smokescreens. Captain Morris wrote once, a terse note that fuel consumption remained problematic, that division had implemented formal limits on smoke generation to manage logistics, and that these limits were being systematically ignored by crews who preferred surviving combat to following supply regulations. Morris didn't explicitly say he was looking the other way, but the implication was clear. He ended the letter with, quote, 141. News from the wider war filtered through official briefings and unofficial gossip. The Japanese advance in the Pacific, the siege of Tobruk, German gains in Russia. The North African campaign had become one front among many, and the diesel smoke trick, which had seemed so important in December, was now a minor tactical detail in a war that spanned continents. In June, Fraser received notification that, quote, 142 had been knocked out during the Gazala battles. The tank had been struck by aerial bombardment, a Stuka's bomb landing directly on the engine deck while the crew was using smoke generation. All hands lost. The notification was clinical, bureaucratic, designed to convey information without emotion. Tank registration number, crew names, date and location of loss, disposition of remains. Fraser read the notification 3 times, trying to extract meaning beyond the bare facts. Had the smoke contributed to the bomber's targeting? Had it obscured the tank enough to throw off the aim? Or had it simply marked the location? Impossible to know. Peters and his crew were dead regardless, and whether smoke generation had helped or hindered was academic, except as data for Chen's analysis. He added the information to Chen's notebook, another data point on the graph tracking the tactic's evolution. Then he filed the notification away and continued teaching trainees about tactical employment of smokescreens, explaining procedures and principles while carefully not mentioning that the tank he'd commanded through the development of those procedures had been destroyed by a bomb that probably ignored the smoke entirely. War continued, indifferent to individual innovations or losses. The smoke trick persisted in some units, was abandoned in others, evolved in ways Fraser would never hear about because he was now thousands of miles from the fighting, teaching classroom theory to people who'd never experienced combat. This was how knowledge fractured and dissipated, not through dramatic failure, but through the gradual dispersion of people who'd learned lessons that couldn't be adequately documented or transmitted. Fraser wondered sometimes if the smoke generation tactic would survive the war, or if it would be forgotten, a footnote in technical manuals that future historians might stumble across and misinterpret. He wondered if McKenzie was still alive, still coaxing smoke from diesel engines, still adapting to German countermeasures. He wondered if anyone would remember that this had started with an accidental fuel leak and a corporal's observation about German shells missing their target. Mostly, he wondered if anything they'd done had mattered in the grand scheme of a war that consumed innovations and lives with equal indifference, always demanding new solutions to problems that never stopped evolving. The diesel smoke trick never appeared in official British armoured warfare doctrine during the North African campaign, despite its semi-formal adoption and the standardized modification kits distributed from Cairo. This absence was partly bureaucratic inertia. Formal doctrine took months or years to revise, and battlefield innovations moved faster than institutional procedures. But it was also deliberate caution. Any technique codified in official documents risked accelerating enemy countermeasures through captured manuals or intelligence leaks. Instead, the knowledge persisted through informal networks, transmitted from experienced crews to replacements through demonstration and shared experience rather than written instruction. New tank commanders arriving in theatre learned about smoke generation not from training manuals, but from sergeants like McKenzie, who'd explain the technique while showing them valve operation on battered tanks held together by improvisation and determination. By mid-1942, the tactic's effectiveness had stabilized at roughly 10 to 15% reduction in enemy hit probability under optimal conditions. Wind calm, terrain favorable, enemy units inexperienced with the countermeasures. This was marginal improvement, the kind of advantage that wouldn't show up in strategic analysis, but might mean the difference between a crew surviving an engagement or not. Some units continued using smoke generation routinely. Others abandoned it as more trouble than it was worth. The fuel consumption and engine wear not justified by minimal tactical benefit. The divergence in practice created an odd situation where identical tanks in adjacent units might employ completely different tactics based on commander preference and institutional memory. This decentralisation bothered staff officers who wanted standardised procedures, but it also allowed continued experimentation that formal doctrine would have suppressed. Lieutenant Walsh, whose crew had bailed out of the burning _quote_143_ back in December, had returned to duty in March, commanding a replacement Matilda. He'd developed a variation on the smoke generation technique based on his experience being mortared while using smoke screens. Instead of continuous smoke generation during advance, Walsh would pulse the smoke, generate it for 30 seconds, stop for 15, generate again for another 30. The pulsing created moving gaps in the smoke cloud that disrupted German range finding, but also allowed Walsh's crew to observe their surroundings periodically. The technique was harder on engines than continuous generation. The rapid cycling of fuel injection stressed components designed for steady operation, but it was tactically more flexible. German gunners found the intermittent smoke unpredictable, harder to compensate for than steady clouds that moved at consistent speed. Walsh had documented his variation in a report to Captain Morris, who'd filed it with his other collection of unauthorized but effective innovations. But Walsh's technique required precise timing and coordination between commander and driver, skills that came from practice rather than instruction. Attempts to replicate it in other crews often failed because the timing was wrong or the driver couldn't smoothly transition between normal and smoke generation operation. This was the persistent problem with battlefield innovations. They often depended on individual skill and judgment that couldn't be systematized. Private Chen, now working in signals intelligence in Cairo, continued his analytical work on a different scale. He'd been assigned to a section monitoring German tactical communications, looking for patterns that might reveal doctrine or intentions. The work was tedious, hours of listening to fragmentary radio traffic, most of it routine logistics or position reports, but occasionally revealing. In July, Chen identified a pattern in German anti-tank communications that suggested doctrinal confusion about how to engage smoke-generating tanks. Veteran units had developed effective countermeasures and communicated these through formal channels. But newer units, particularly those recently arrived from the Eastern Front, didn't have institutional memory of the Australian smoke tactics and were encountering them as novel threats. This created what Chen called, quote, 144, situations where German units adjacent to each other employed completely different tactics against the same Allied technique because their prior experience and training differed. Chen documented this in reports that probably weren't read by anyone who could act on the information, but the pattern intrigued him as evidence that even the methodical Germans struggled with institutional knowledge transfer. The broader war was changing in ways that made the diesel smoke trick increasingly irrelevant. Newer tanks, American Shermans beginning to arrive in theatre, improved British designs, had different engines, different capabilities, different tactical profiles. The Sherman ran on petrol and couldn't replicate the diesel smoke generation, even if crews wanted to. Some units retrofitted Shermans with purpose-built smoke grenade launchers instead, a more conventional approach that produced white phosphorus smoke, fundamentally different from diesel exhaust. German armour was evolving too. The Tiger tanks that began appearing in late 1942 were so heavily armoured that Matilda 2-pounder guns couldn't penetrate them, regardless of smoke screens or tactics. The mathematical equation that had driven Fraser's original innovation, close range before being killed, stopped working when closing to effective range was impossible because no range was effective against Tiger armor. Captain Morris, still managing the workshop at Bir el Gubi through sheer determination and creative supply requisitions, wrote to Fraser in August with an update that was equal parts technical report and obituary. Quote, 145 had finally been retired, not from combat damage, but from accumulated mechanical wear that made her uneconomical to repair. McKenzie had stripped the smoke generation system before the tank was sent to salvage, preserving it like an artifact from an earlier age. Quote, 146, Morris wrote. Quote, 147. Fraser read the letter in his quarters at the training depot, feeling the disconnect between Morris's matter-of-fact prose and the weight of what it described. Waltzing Matilda had been the proof of concept. The tank where the smoke generation technique was first deliberately tested. Now it was scrap metal, and McKenzie was teaching skills that might be obsolete before the current crop of trainees reached combat. The war ground forward with the inexorable momentum of industrial conflict. North Africa transitioned from Axis to Allied control through battles that made the early skirmishes around Tobruk seem small-scale. The diesel smoke trick, which had seemed so innovative in December 1941, became a historical curiosity by late 1942, occasionally mentioned in after-action reports, but no longer a significant tactical factor. Yet it persisted in odd ways. Crews who'd used smoke generation and survived developed superstitious attachments to the technique, using it even when tactical logic suggested it was no longer effective. Some claimed the smoke brought luck, independent of its impact on German rangefinders. Morris dismissed this as magical thinking, but he also didn't discourage it because morale and confidence mattered in ways that couldn't be quantified. Fraser encountered this persistence secondhand through letters from former crew members, now scattered across different units and theatres. A wireless operator from another squadron wrote, describing how his new crew had requested smoke generation capability be installed on their Sherman, even though the engineering made no sense for a petrol engine. They'd rigged something using the engine's oil system that produced thin grey smoke, completely unlike diesel exhaust, and probably increased fire risk significantly. But they'd insisted it made them safer. And who was Fraser to argue with survivors? The question that haunted Fraser during his teaching duties was whether innovation mattered at all in industrial warfare. The diesel smoke trick had worked, briefly, because it exploited a temporary information advantage. The Germans didn't know about it and therefore couldn't counter it. But every innovation created its own countermeasure, and the cycle accelerated until tactics became obsolete before they could be properly documented. Maybe the real value wasn't the tactic itself, but the mindset it represented. The willingness to improvise, to experiment, to try something unconventional when conventional approaches were getting people killed. That mindset couldn't be taught in classrooms or codified in manuals. It emerged from desperation and survival instinct, from sergeants like McKenzie who understood engines well enough to abuse them productively, from junior officers like Fraser who'd been willing to risk court-martial for destroying equipment if it kept crews alive. In September, Fraser received notification that he was being reassigned to a combat unit preparing for deployment to the Pacific Theater. The war was moving, and experienced officers were needed elsewhere. His time teaching was over, which brought relief mixed with apprehension. He'd spent 6 months trying to transmit knowledge he wasn't sure could be transmitted, explaining tactics that might already be obsolete, preparing men for combat he hoped they'd never experience. Before departing, he packaged Chen's notebook and sent it to the Australian War Memorial with a brief cover letter explaining its contents. Someone should preserve this, he thought, even if nobody ever reads it, even if the tactics it documents are forgotten. It represents what soldiers actually did versus what doctrine said they should do. That gap between theory and practice was where wars were actually fought and sometimes won. The notebook disappeared into an archive, one document among thousands, its data and observations preserved but disconnected from the context that made them meaningful. Years later, a researcher might find it, puzzle over the graphs and technical specifications, perhaps write a footnote in a history of armored warfare innovation. Or perhaps not. History was full of forgotten innovations, temporary advantages that had mattered intensely to the people who'd invented them, and meant nothing to anyone who came after. Fraser couldn't know, that the diesel smoke trick would persist in fragmentary ways through the rest of the war and beyond, not as doctrine, but as institutional memory carried by survivors who'd learned that sometimes the difference between living and dying came down to unconventional solutions to problems that shouldn't have existed in the first place. Military historians researching the North African campaign occasionally encounter references to exhaust smoke generation in Australian unit reports from late 1941 and early 1942. The mentions are brief, technical, unremarkable, the kind of detail that gets cut when condensing thousands of pages of war diaries into coherent narratives. Most historians skip past these references entirely, focused on larger strategic questions about supply lines, command decisions, and battle outcomes that shaped the theater's eventual Allied victory. A few researchers have noticed the pattern, the cluster of reports mentioning diesel smoke appearing suddenly in December 1941 and then gradually diminishing through early 1942. Some have speculated about coordinated tactical innovation, others about responses to specific German weapon systems. None have fully reconstructed what actually happened, how a damaged fuel line, a mechanic's knowledge of diesel engines, and a junior officer's desperate observation combined into a technique that briefly shifted the odds in a war of mathematics and industrial production. Sergeant McKenzie returned to Brisbane after the war and went back to working on diesel engines, this time for fishing trawlers and commercial trucks rather than tanks. He never mentioned the smoke modification to customers, though occasionally he'd encounter other veterans who'd served in armour units during the North Africa campaign. They'd share a particular look, an acknowledgement of shared experience that didn't require explanation. Once, in 1953, a man who'd been a tank driver asked McKenzie if he remembered that trick with the smoke back in Libya. McKenzie had nodded, said it had been a long time ago, and changed the subject. Some memories were better left unexamined. The German optical rangefinder that Fraser had seen at Tobruk ended up in an Australian military museum after the war, part of a collection of captured equipment displayed in glass cases with explanatory placards. The card describes the rangefinder's function and precision, explains how stereoscopic optics calculated distance through triangulation, notes that these instruments gave German anti-tank crews significant advantages in long-range engagement. It doesn't mention that columns of diesel smoke could render such precision temporarily useless, or that Australian tank crews had learned to exploit this weakness through deliberate engine abuse. Private Chen's career in signals intelligence continued through the Pacific Campaign and into the post-war occupation of Japan. He eventually became a university lecturer in Melbourne, teaching communications theory and occasionally mentioning his wartime experience when it was relevant to technical discussions. His old notebook, the one documenting smoke generation effectiveness over time, remained in the War Memorial's archives, catalogued but rarely accessed. In 1967, an engineering journal published a paper on diesel exhaust manipulation for agricultural fumigation purposes. One of the cited references was a 1946 Australian Army technical bulletin about supplementary smoke generation in armoured vehicles. The connection between fumigating crops and surviving German anti-tank fire went unremarked. Lieutenant, later Colonel, Fraser died in 1983, having served in multiple theatres and campaigns after North Africa. His personal effects included a photograph of Bardia Bill, wreathed in black smoke, though the image quality was poor and the smoke made details hard to distinguish. On the back, someone had written, .175, December 3rd. First time we tried it properly. Worked better than we had any right to expect. The photograph was donated to the War Memorial, along with Fraser's other papers, where it was filed with thousands of similar images documenting the Australian experience in the Second World War. The diesel smoke trick was exactly the kind of battlefield innovation that doesn't make headlines or appear in strategic histories. It wasn't dramatic enough for legend, too specific for broad doctrine, too crude for academic analysis. It was practical knowledge, developed under pressure by people who needed solutions more than they needed recognition, who were trying to survive rather than make history. In the end, perhaps that was appropriate. The men who generated those black clouds across the Libyan desert weren't attempting to revolutionize armored warfare or develop lasting tactical doctrine. They were trying to stay alive long enough to matter, using whatever advantages they could fabricate from diesel fuel, improvised valves, and the fortunate physics of incomplete combustion. Some of them succeeded, others didn't. The smoke trick bought time, shifted odds slightly in favor of survival, created temporary confusion in an enemy that was learning to counter every innovation almost as fast as it appeared. The technique's life cycle, from invention through effectiveness to obsolescence, compressed into roughly 6 months what usually took years in military innovation. This acceleration was characteristic of the North African campaign, where distance from bureaucratic oversight allowed experimentation, where supply difficulties forced improvisation, where the desperate mathematics of survival encouraged unconventional solutions. Whether the diesel smoke trick mattered in the grand scheme of the war is impossible to determine. It didn't change strategic outcomes, didn't win battles, didn't alter the trajectory of campaigns. But it kept some tank crews alive who might otherwise have died, and for those crews, it mattered absolutely. History is constructed from countless small innovations like this, temporary advantages, local solutions, techniques that worked until they didn't, most of which are forgotten because they don't fit into narratives about decisive battles or brilliant strategies. Somewhere in archives and museums, fragments of the diesel smoke trick persist. Technical bulletins, modification kits, after-action reports, Chen's notebook with its careful graphs documenting declining effectiveness. These artifacts exist disconnected from the context that made them meaningful, waiting for researchers who might someday reconstruct the story of how Australian tank crews learned to turn engine exhaust into tactical advantage, however briefly. The story matters not because it changed history, but because it represents how soldiers actually fought, improvisationally, desperately, creatively, versus how doctrine suggested they should fight. That gap between theory and practice, between what manuals prescribed and what survival required, was where the real war happened. And sometimes, in that gap, a damaged fuel line and a mechanic's intuition could make the difference between living and dying in the North African desert. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel and support the video with a like or comment. Your engagement helps us continue exploring forgotten innovations and untold stories from history.